Why silence saved the system? No statement calmed the markets. No speech restored confidence. In fact, the moment stability returned, leaders said almost nothing at all, and somehow that silence achieved what words could not. To understand why silence mattered, we must return to a moment when every sentence risked doing harm. Expectations were fragile. Trust was conditional. Any declaration could be misread, challenged, or tested immediately. In such an environment, clarity did not reassure. It provoked reaction. And reaction was a danger. The first reveal begins with restraint at the top. Officials resisted the instinct to explain. Press briefings were minimal. Language was vague. Commitments were implied rather than promised. This was not confusion. It was calibration. Speaking too clearly would have forced the system to respond before it was ready. The second beat followed as markets adjusted to absence of signal. Without dramatic messaging, participants relied on behavior instead of interpretation. Prices stabilized because no new narrative pushed them to move. Silence removed pressure to react. It allowed caution to replace reflex. What made this effective was expectation management. In past crises, words escalated fear by setting benchmarks markets immediately tested. This time, silence avoided that trap. Nothing was promised. Nothing was denied. The system was left room to stabilize on its own terms. By the time observers asked why leaders were not speaking, the worst danger had already passed. Stability had returned not because confidence was declared, but because uncertainty was allowed to fade without being challenged publicly. This was not absence of leadership. It was leadership through restraint. And in a system hypersensitive to signal, silence became the safest form of action. As the silence held, its effects deepened across the system. Without new guidance to interpret, institutions stopped waiting for cues from above. They watched each other instead. Behavior replaced rhetoric as the primary signal. What mattered was not what leaders might say, but what participants were actually doing. The reveal grew clearer as volatility eased without explanation. No corrective narrative forced alignment. No promise invited challenge. The absence of language removed targets for speculation. Markets could not test silence. They could only respond to reality unfolding slowly in front of them. The conflict emerged in public perception. Silence unsettled observers accustomed to constant reassurance. Critics demanded clarity. Commentators filled the vacuum with theories. Yet inside the system, restraint was working. Words would have accelerated reaction. Silence allowed hesitation to decay naturally. The buildup intensified as time passed without incident. Each uneventful hour reinforced calm. Participants gained confidence not from declarations, but from the lack of disruption. Stability began to feel earned rather than enforced. The system adjusted downward from tension instead of swinging between extremes. What made this approach risky was its fragility. Silence works only when backed by readiness. Behind the quiet, safeguards stood prepared. Backstops existed but remained unseen. The system knew support was available if needed, and that knowledge made silence credible. By now, a subtle shift had occurred. Authority was no longer expressed through instruction, but through self-control. Leadership meant knowing when not to speak. Influence came from removing noise rather than adding signal. The system was stabilizing itself, not because it was told everything would be fine, but because nothing was said that made it worse. The tension peaked when silence itself became the subject of scrutiny. Observers questioned whether leaders had lost control or were hiding something. Pressure mounted to explain, clarify, and reassure. Speaking now would have satisfied curiosity, but it risked reopening uncertainty that had just begun to fade. The conflict sharpened as competing narratives threatened to fill the void. Speculation multiplied. Analysts projected outcomes onto the absence of guidance. Yet each attempt to interpret silence weakened as nothing followed. Predictions failed. Panic did not arrive. Over time, the noise exhausted itself. The buildup intensified inside institutions. Decision makers learned to operate without external cues. They relied on internal thresholds and peer behavior rather than official messaging. This reduced synchronized overreaction. Without a central signal to react to, actions staggered. The system avoided moving all at once. What became clear was a psychological shift. Silence removed the focal point that often accelerates fear. In past crises, a single sentence could trigger mass response. Here, the absence of language denied markets that coordination point. Uncertainty dispersed instead of concentrating. Behind the calm, readiness remained constant. Silence was not abandonment. It was containment. Support mechanisms stood prepared but unused. Knowing help existed, but was not being advertised, reinforced discipline. Participants trusted that intervention would come only if truly necessary. By this stage, stability had returned without declaration. The system recalibrated itself downward from stress rather than upward from reassurance. Silence had done what words often fail to do. It had allowed fear to run out of momentum. And once fear loses momentum, it no longer needs to be confronted. The moment passed without explanation, and that was its strength. When leaders finally spoke, their words no longer carried urgency. They described stability that already existed. The system had moved on before language arrived to describe it. The climax was not silence itself, but the recognition of its power. By refusing to add signal at the most sensitive moment, authority avoided becoming the trigger. Markets did not need reassurance. They needed space. Silence provided that space when clarity would have forced reaction. The resolution followed quietly. Communication returned gradually, stripped of drama. Statements described processes, not promises. Expectations were managed without spectacle. The lesson was internalized across institutions. Not every crisis demands a message. Some demand restraint strong enough to resist the urge to explain. What endured from this episode was a recalibration of leadership under stress. Speaking is influence. Silence is also influence. Knowing which to use determines whether stability accelerates or unravels. In systems driven by anticipation, removing signal can be the most decisive act. Europe learned that authority is not always loud. Sometimes it is measured by what remains unsaid. When words become fuel, restraint becomes control. And when silence is intentional, it can carry more weight than any announcement. Wise silence saved the system was never written into policy. It was learned by watching what happened when nothing was said. So what do you think? When leaders stay silent in a crisis, are they absent or are they protecting the system from itself? Wise